Hello, friends, and welcome back to Misshelved, your bi-weekly dose of bookstore love. I'm your host, Nicole Brinkley, and I am so excited to be bringing you another episode. For those of you who are new to the podcast, welcome. Every week, I introduce you to an independent bookseller as they sit down in conversation with one of their favorite authors. This week's independent bookseller is Read Davidson.
Hi, my name is Read Davidson. I work at Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I am an assistant manager there.
Read is one of my favorite booksellers and has been since I met Zer at a book selling conference, a few years ago now. Read is sitting down in conversation with K.M. Szpara.
Hi, I am Kellen Szpara. I publish as K.M. Szpara. I am a queer and trans author who lives in Baltimore, Maryland, but used to live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I am the author of First Become Ashes, which came out on April 6, 2021, and Docile, which came out in 2020.
Settle in as these two talk about sex in fiction, both fan fiction and traditionally published fiction, the importance of queer and trans representation in sex, and a whole lot about the Magicians fanfic.
This is where I confess that I simply reread Jurassic Park and the Lost World 5 times over and over again because I was seeking comfort reads, and that is apparently dinosaurs eating bad people.
I have not read Jurassic Park World. I have not done the thing, but I can relate, at least in thematic, to rereading the same thing over and over. I think my equivalent of that has been not exactly rereading anything, although I probably have reread at least one giant fan fiction in the past year, but has been reading Fix-It Fix in the Magicians fandom ad nauseum.
Ooh, okay. I read the Magicians books a long time ago and forgot what they were about, so I listened to the audiobooks. And not too long ago, I can see where some Fix-It Fix. I would also like the sexy version, like the Magicians plus sex, which is not totally not a thing that's influenced me.
That's fair. So I will confess to being a bad book person in here and having only seen the television show. And from my understanding, the books and television show have more of an aspirational relationship to each other than a particularly adherent one.
I mean, so I've seen some of the TV show, and it's one of those, everyone's pretty and the magic looks incredibly cool. That's one of the reasons I was so drawn to it, because of the way they filmed the magic scenes. The book I read because I was like, there's a gay in this? And it was one of the first fantasy novels where I was like, there's a major gay in this. I must read the gay. And Sweet Elliot, whom I love so much, not actually very sweet. Who are your ships? I need to know.
Elliot is, I think from my understanding, I think Elliot is a little bit sweeter in the show. I mean, it's a bunch of people in the early to mid-20s, so people kind of fuck around, but to the extent that there's sort of at least fandom through line of a relationship, it would be Quentin and Elliot. And I don't know how much they're a thing in the books, but in the show, Quentin and Elliot are immediate fast friends, and I think that Margot's character is named Janet in the books. They also rename characters.
One of the best scenes in that TV show, if you don't mind me saying, is when they're in Fillory and they're in that sort of time bubble where they're trying to access one of the keys. And it's maybe 5 minutes of Elliot and Quentin sort of growing old together. I think there's also, one of them gets married and there's a child, and it's just so beautiful. I was like, this is the fan fiction I didn't know I need, but it's in the show. It's canon.
That's why I started watching The Magicians, is I don't know how I got here. At some point I was reading fan fiction in a completely different fandom, beats me what it was. And I was reading through one author's whole back catalog, and then I ran out of stuff from that author in fandoms that I was a part of, but they had written Magicians fanfic, and I was like, I vaguely know what The Magicians is as an IP. And so I don't do this super often, but every now and then when I really like a fanfic author's work, but I've run out of fandoms that I'm familiar with, I'll branch out and try reading another one of their fics in a fandom I'm not familiar with at all. It's hit or miss whether or not that works or makes any sense. But actually, because so much Quentin Elliott or Quelliot, which is what I will say from now
That's
on.
a cute ship name.
Yeah. I at the time I was reading Magicians fanfic, I think it was when they were either partway into season 4 or in between seasons 3 and 4. And so most Quelliot fic was set during sort of that episode, which gets just called Mosaic fic.
Mm.
And so because that episode is just a montage, there's so much you can fill in with fan fiction for it, and you can really like kind of go anywhere you want. So I've seen a lot of different interpretations of like what their relationship was to each other and what their relationship was to Ariel, who is the person that Quentin marries in that timeline. All of it was explicit because I am the most stereotypical fan fiction reader that exists, and I feel no shame about that. I do in fact read fan fiction for the explicit purpose of reading characters f***ing each other because I enjoy that.
I mean, that's what I look for in fan fiction too when I was much too young to be reading fan fiction. You know, I mean, nobody was watching you on the internet in like 1997. So I was left alone to just sort of click through that button that was like, I'm definitely 18 years old and deserve to be reading this. My fandoms back then were mostly dreary, which, you know, I still ship it.
Yes.
I have two. It's too bad we're not on video call because I have 2 tattoos that I got in 2020, my dreary tattoos, and people are like, dreary in this economy? And I'm like, yes, J.K. Rowling is clearly trash, but dreary
She's not
is
making
forever.
any money off your tattoo.
I know. I supported a local artist, and it's very gay. I got Harry's wand on the outside of my right arm and Draco's wand on the outside of my left arm. And so, you know, I can make like the tips touch. But I got them, of course, during a time when I'm out in public, almost not at all. So I'm pretty desperate to go back into the public square and show off my very gay Harry Potter tattoos in public.
I, definitely relate to reading explicit fan fiction at much too young an age. Although, you know, I think it worked out for me. I actually think that I am probably much better at sex having read just a plethora of explicit fan fiction in my...
Definitely, I learned more in fan fiction than I did in sex ed class.
100%.
Okay. I remember very clearly being in English lit class in like 9th grade, and I knew the word prostate, but I didn't know the word prostrate. And we were reading like Shakespeare, and it was something like prostrate themselves. And I was like looking around the room like, does everyone else know what this word means? But it was just me. I was the one who didn't know what prostrate means.
I don't think that I ever had that particular moment, but there were definitely a few times upon encountering the word prostrate where I had to like look at it a little bit longer than necessary. I don't read Harry Potter fan fiction that often anymore, even before J.K. Rowling
was terrible.
Yeah.
Openly.
My impression is that most people kind of just go through fandom phases, and sometimes I come back to old ones. I was reading Harry Potter fan fiction before Archive of Our Own was really a thing, and so
Same.
In my head, Harry Potter fan fiction exists on fanfiction.net, and I don't go back to fanfiction.net really ever.
I mostly read when it was like databases that were called things like The Boy Who Lived. It was just like all Harry and Draco. Like when I was reading in like 1990 ... like Hanson fan fiction when I was younger, and there was like a whole hansonfanfiction.com, which like does not exist anymore.
Yeah, I was definitely at the sunsetting of like LiveJournal and fic websites. I think fanfiction.net had existed for a while at that point, but I think had not really become the like default place people went to for fanfiction. I think it was still sort of split across a myriad of places, especially because of fanfiction.net's attempt to exclude explicit fanfiction from its platform.
Like there's other kinds of fan. Okay, I guess. Oh, is that what I hear about this sort of coffee shop AU where everyone's in a coffee shop and not having sex?
Coffee shop AUs? Yeah, exactly. A good coffee shop AU can still have a lot of sex.
Amen. I haven't read one yet, but I feel like that's a goal for me for 2021. Find a good explicit coffee shop AU.
I think that I have only really read coffee shop AUs in the Merlin fandom, BBC Merlin's. I think more than most fandoms I've been in, the Merlin fandom seems to really enjoy their alternate universes. I can't really, now that I work in retail, I can't really read retail AUs of any kind. I did.
Oh, valid.
There was actually a magician's fic that was like partially set in a bookstore, and I enjoyed most of the fic, but every single time cut to the bookstore, I was like, that wouldn't happen. That's not realistic. What are you talking about? And in fairness, it was a used bookstore. And while my store does have a used section, I don't work there, so I don't really know what goes on there. But enough of the other stuff was just clearly stuff that wouldn't happen at any kind of bookstore that I had to just ignore it.
This is the problem because you're always thinking there is somebody out there who's an expert in what you're writing, or like it's their real daily experience. And so it's like, can't set something in a bookstore because if you get bookstores wrong, all the bookstore people, and that's obviously why research is a real thing. In the book that I'm revising right now, which will be a trans vampire novel eventually when I finish it, one of the characters is an intern, surgical intern.
Mhm.
Most of my research was that I rewatched all 17 seasons of Grey's Anatomy and lots of vlogs by doctors who then went, here's everything that's wrong with Grey's Anatomy. But come on, I love that. I don't know if you're a Grey's fan, but I'm like dead into it.
I think Grey's Anatomy is one of those shows that I like watched partially in syndication, and then eventually, like when Netflix was a thing, went back and like tried to watch it from the beginning, and then vaguely followed along.
It got really gay.
I was there for part of the gay. I think that it lost me at the end of season 7, I think. Not for the gay reasons, obviously. I think I got very overwhelmed by Meredith and Derek's whole deal. I was not interested in it. I like Meredith as a character, actually, and that is part of why I wasn't interested in her and Derek's whole deal, because I think that Derek is a terrible person.
Meredith and Christina's relationship, like, is the best, and I'm more worried about them friend breaking up than I am about Meredith and Derek breaking up.
Yeah.
Like, spoiler, he gets hit by a truck eventually, so.
I was aware, I was still on Facebook when that happened, and all of the people I was friends with were very upset about him dying. And when I learned he had died, I was like, this is the first time I've considered starting to watch Grey's Anatomy again. And I didn't, but I was not at all sad by him dying. I was like,
Valid.
Good for Meredith.
Valid. I was surprised because I hadn't really been caught up. And so I went back when I was watching, like, there's now trans characters on the show, and also lots of sort of like short trans storylines. And the show has been on the upswing. And I was like, wow, there's a trans guy on this show. That's new. There's some really adorable gays that are having sex on screen. And the show has just gotten very queer. And I'm very into it. Did like the straights know that this has become a gay show?
Maybe I will go back and just get a recap of the interim seasons. I've mostly been, to the extent I've been watching things, I've mostly been watching video essays on YouTube, but usually am very much a TV person. It takes a lot of energy for me to get started on new things, and I don't think I have had the energy to start new things.
Well, that's why I rewatched 17 seasons of Grey's Anatomy. I mean, also, like, for 10 seconds, let me just pitch you why you should read Jurassic Park.
Okay.
I've brought this up on way too many podcasts this promo season, but like the more I reread Jurassic Park and the Lost World, the more I'm like, Michael Crichton did not have all this in mind. Trust. But he had some of it in mind. And it basically is like a story about these queer dinosaurs who eat the people who have thrust like mega corporations onto them. And like, okay, so dinosaurs are all female in air quotes, and then life finds a way. And suddenly there are male dinosaurs. And Michael Crichton's morality is based on, if you are bad, then you die. Like, almost entirely. And so the people who are greedy and who don't care about making good decisions and who don't care about life and who don't care about people, they're the ones who are hunted and eaten by these dinosaurs, that found a way despite their initial programming. And I just relate to those dinosaurs so much. There's so much sermonizing in the book about how we have to be careful with power and all this stuff. And I just love me some trans dinosaurs eating billionaires.
I mean, I can get behind eating billionaires. Also, I'm wondering how much this did or did not have an impact on your short story where there are dinosaur dildos.
I did. I always forget that story. That's funny because I was doing one of my many annual rereads of Jurassic Park, and I just tweeted, like, the reason that story exists and that anthology exists is because I tweeted, like, who has the IP rights for Jurassic Park, and why am I not being allowed to write like a Jurassic Park story? And then Michael Thomas at Uncanny was like, we will do this. Obviously not IP, like, don't come at us, estate of Michael Crichton. I was like, this is what I want. I want Life Finds a Way, and I want to put actual trans people there. I think a lot of the times when we see stuff in fiction, like when we talk about Drary, and it's like when we have all these sort of like pairings that are not literal to the text, like that's us reading into the text. You know, it's me reading trans dinosaurs eat billionaires into Jurassic Park. But like, I think what's cooler is, you know, as a creator, to take the things that we are seeing and interpreting and put them right there into those texts and like disrupt them, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, and there's the ongoing debate and analytical conversation about queer baiting. And certainly it's frustrating when it happens. But I imagine that it's more frustrating for people who don't read fan fiction. I don't know what their lives are like, but I would much rather have a Person of Interest, which is a CBS, starts kind of like a police procedural, but not with police. It's about an AI who like spits out the social security number of someone who's about to be at the center of some sort of violent crime per day, and then they have to figure it out. Anyway, but it eventually becomes sort of like a sci-fi drama, and there are two female characters in the show who have a lot of chemistry and who flirt a lot on screen, and I don't think the showrunners had any intention of making them a couple, and they, I think, could have leaned into fans shipping them in a queerbaity way, but instead they leaned into fans shipping them and actually made them a couple.
Oh, okay, good. I support that.
Yeah, and there are probably other criticisms to be made of Person of Interest for its queer representation, but as far as like queer baiting goes, they did make that relationship textual, and I love that. But I also think that there's a particular dynamic in relationships that are identified as queer baiting versus intentionally queer relationships that actually feel queer to me often. There are distinctions between like the ways canonical queer relationships are depicted across media, in television specifically, rather than literature. But I think in television, it's still far more the norm that your writer's room is mostly going to be made up of straight people. And I think when straight people try to write gay people, they're a little too heavy-handed, not even in like a stereotypical way. When I like talk to my girlfriend about queer stuff, like a recurring through line is that like pining and longing is such just a queer phenomenon. And I feel like you actually don't see a lot of pining in canonical queer stories and television, but it's very easy to read that pining and longing into like queer baity couples. And so then in fan fiction you get to extrapolate that, and you get to like, I mean, I don't usually torture myself with slow burns.
It's funny because I have a friend who is like sort of queen of slow burn, wants to write an entire book, dragging it out, and I'm like, please, this hurts me on the inside. Like, yes, I pine in real life. That's why I don't want to pine in fiction. Just hook up in the book. A lot of the ways that I write queer relationships are aspirational, in that I, for example, don't have great like experiences with cis gay men. And I am, you know, homo romantic. So I want to be in a relationship with a man of any persuasion. And a thing that I tend to give to lots of my characters or my trans characters, are cis boyfriends who are cool. because I'm like, maybe I can brainwash cis people out there into like realizing they're wildly overreacting and this is very hot. I'm going to write you a very hot sex scene. Please keep reading. You will like it. Just don't be scared. And so when I wrote the dinosaur story, that was the first time I wrote two trans people together. But because I'm so often feeling like if I can almost manifest things that I wish were true in the world, like sort of through my own work, that aspirational, sort of creation. And, I'm not trying to pine forever. I'm trying to have a mild, happy ending at a minimum. And, trying to have someone who thinks that I'm hot and wants to be with me. So I try to give that also to my trans protagonists.
I'm bi, and I knew that I was bi, to my understanding, what is comparatively a young age for most queer people realizing things about themselves. I knew I was bi at 13 and came out to my mom at that age, not entirely intentionally. It was fine for the most part. And then didn't exactly come out. Not enough people knew or cared about me in middle/high school for me to come out to my school, but I wasn't purposefully staying in the closet or anything.
Mm-hmm.
And before realizing that I was non-binary, I still read a lot of explicit fan fiction of all kinds, including cis men sleeping together. There isn't enough of bi people talking about the ways they experience attraction ever, in queer spaces, in not queer spaces, in their own spaces. And obviously, sort of with the benefit of hindsight, I think what I'm about to say is contextualized differently, but the way that I have always experienced attraction to men has not ever felt like it was coming from a straight place, but also not exactly from a place of femininity or womanness either.
It feels different to be attracted to men from a non, obviously we have different identities, but
Yeah.
as somebody who has transitioned and has been attracted to men the whole time, I was identifying as a straight girl and now I
Yeah.
identify as a guy who likes guys, to be very simplistic with my identity. But it feels different, it feels better, and it's, well, for me it feels better, it's not, and I don't know that that's something people can really understand if they haven't gone through some kind of evolution of their identity.
I think that I really am, as a queer person, attracted to the idea of sameness and similarity, and in sort of all of the different forms that can take, including sort of bodily similarity, the eroticism of sharing pleasure with someone whose body is like your own, that you are familiar with, and obviously all bodies experience pleasures in different ways, no matter what assemblage of things they have, but that someone with a vagina and a clit, or whatever they choose to call that broadly understood makeup of parts, presumably knows what feels good for them sexually, and extrapolate that to a similar body in a way that is different, and the intimacy of that sameness. But then obviously that in not just bodily but in other ways, that similarity and sameness does still exist between a trans person and a cis person of the same gender. And so I think exploring the places where that sameness does line up and where the difference doesn't, but where you can bridge that difference. And I think that's why I am a non-binary person who actually, as far as my dysphoria goes, a lot of my dysphoria actually is most prevalent in my sex life. And because that's more true, I feel like I almost never encounter people talking about sexual dysphoria, because we don't, and I mean in entirely understandable ways, trans people don't want to obsess about their genitalia and don't want to be fetishized, but it also means that the only times really I have ever read other people talk about having sex from a trans perspective is in fan fiction, because there isn't much fan fiction with explicit sex. That's there isn't much fiction with explicit sex to begin with, let alone with trans people, let alone queer trans sex that is also queer in some other way. I think that one of the things that I have liked about both of your stories that do include trans characters who have sex is, even when they haven't been sort of at all the same as my own sexual experiences, getting to like watch the different ways that trans people experience like sexual pleasure in their bodies, and the ways
Hmm.
that like does line up with how cis people might experience sexual pleasure and how it doesn't, and how like trans people have to navigate that space, and how it's like basically always complicated.
It is always complicated. Before I forget, and because you've used the phrase sameness so much, I need to mention a local artist named James Mayhew has a project from many years ago that I got to see in person called Samesies Island. Samesies Island, and you can Google Samesies Island, James Mayhew. Samesies Island is an imaginary utopian separatist community for transmasculine attracted transmasculine folks, and it touches all upon like a lot of the stuff that you sort of were saying about how like, I mean, that's not necessarily my like sexual orientation, but I know so many trans guys who are in relationship with trans guys, even locally, and that is that experience of you're kind of going through the same thing, but we also acknowledge the many differences and complexities within each other. And I think that's something very sort of unique to being a trans and or a non-binary person is we're also used to thinking complexly about our bodies, the words we use to describe ourselves, how our sexual, orientations can evolve based on how our identity is evolving.
One of the things that I really enjoy about fictional explorations of sex and romance and gender is being able to experience things that I can't explore in my personal life for whatever
Hmm.
reason, in ways that connect to things not that I necessarily feel like I'm missing, but things that I have not had the opportunity to experience that I might not ever have the opportunity to experience. I know that you're not extremely active on Twitter, and honestly I'm not really either, but I think we're both people who get our hackles a little bit raised whenever we inevitably return to the sex in fiction isn't necessary. But if we think that representation in fiction is like important and valuable, like sex is also a form of representation. Like people don't have sex in
Hmm.
the same ways. And so like wholly beyond like whether or not the fact that like sex scenes in fiction can contribute to characterization or like move the plot along or what have you, also just people have sex. That's a part of what people do in the same way that people fight or people, I don't know, save the world. Like people have sex, and people have sex in a lot of different ways, and we already live in a culture that has a lot of baggage about the fact that people have sex and enjoy it. But people
Hmm.
who have sex in what are broadly assumed to be atypical ways have even more baggage. I think even if they're the
Yep.
people who are sort of loudest about like enjoying sex, I think that the people who are loudest about enjoying sex are probably also the people who have the most baggage about having it.
As you were saying, I don't tweet. I try not to tweet very often because Twitter can sort of like get in your head. But, I literally just recently was like, I choose to write sex. And if there are many content, the content warnings on the front of my book that say, amongst other things, there's explicit sex in here. If you should not read that, and if it's not your thing, because I'm really interested in exploring what happens during those moments. I think that especially growing up, as a person who like evolved and like into a very complicated queer person, I didn't know how to navigate lots of those situations. Another reason why I explore things like kink and consent and multiple partners and navigating relationships is because I didn't see or learn about that at all when I was growing up. I think that it's really important to show these different types of relationships. I mean, what are stories if not relationships? And two or more people having sex, even one person having sex, exploring their own body. Like these are all relationships and extremely intimate ones that are sort of rife with exploration and conflict. And it's part of my goal to sort of put that out there, like discussions that are otherwise faded to black, in other situations. I want them to be highlighted for those who want to see them.
Even thinking about sort of porn versus erotica versus non-explicit sex that still happens on page, sort of like in the I think Kat Sebastian actually does that. She is fairly explicit. She's a romance author. Her sex scenes they would be rated M on an Archive of Our Own. They mention explicit body parts, but like while the sex is happening on page, it is largely like most of the descriptive stuff is about the character's experience.
I call this family-friendly sex, which is the weirdest term for it, but it's like I can talk about it on a podcast.
Basically, it's rated R, like a scene where like you would be maybe a little bit uncomfortable watching it with your parents in the room, but like you can both kind of watch it, but just not look at each other while you're watching it. I'm okay with like sort of the whole gamut of explicit versus hinted at sex on page. But I think one of the things that I really like about really explicit sex scenes on page is that it can do both the work of sort of how the characters are feeling emotionally and also how they are feeling in their bodies, which is actually the thing that is missing from visual porn. And I think often the porn that I've enjoyed the most has been when you just get like an actual like candid conversation between the two people who are later going to each other on screen for 30 minutes, where they like talk to each other about what they like or about like the conversation they had right before filming, that moment of like understanding that even if the sex that they were having was happening for professional reasons and was mediated by a lot of other things and had a camera on them and isn't how they would likely have sex in the privacy of their own homes. I don't want to say that it's not them having real sex, but it's a performance nonetheless. That's sort of, I think, the closest you can get in a purely visual medium of still sort of understanding those people in relation to sex. And I do think that part of why another argument against sort of like sex isn't necessary in fiction is that like fiction, people read fiction and read stories for all kinds of reasons, but I think broadly speaking, people understand that one of the reasons we read is to entertain ourselves. And sex is entertaining.
It sure is. Christ. Like the number of people who are like, oh, there's nothing in here. There's no plot. There's no whatever. And I'm like, fine, you don't enjoy it. Whatever. One of the first pieces of media I watched that was sexually explicit that hugely influenced the way that I write everything is Queer as Folk, which looking at it now as a person who's not just like, wow, gays. Like, I mean, it's like mostly cis white gays, masculine presenting, not the best representation of the queer communities that like I know and am a part of, but they had like a plot relevant rim job in the opening scenes.
Yeah.
Like, and I was like, people can do this. I'm going to do this. So I just started doing it and everyone was like, this is weird. You can't do this. I was like, but Queer as Folk did this in like 2000, like
on Showtime.
One. Yeah, on Showtime. But like, I mean, what is a publisher if not a pay to play? You do have to buy the book. So that's on you. I feel like we are at the end of our conversation, which is so sad because I definitely could keep talking to you about more than just sex and fiction, but also sex and fiction.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening to our conversation. I hope that you enjoyed us talking about sex in all of its many wonderful incarnations, trans, fanfic, professionally published fiction, etc. I am K.M. Szpara. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram, both at KMSZPARA. And my website is kmszpara.com. Read, how about you?
Mostly you can find me on Twitter lurking. My handle is @disasterhumans, which is a Critical Role reference. But actually, you could also find me on Tumblr there. I have also been a bit of a ghost on Tumblr, but if I leave Twitter, I will probably go back to Tumblr. I don't talk about book selling on my Tumblr. I just talk about Critical Role. Fair warning. Other than that, you can find me in my bookstore at Harvard in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and occasionally writing about books elsewhere on the internet when people ask me to.
I feel really weird to say I can't wait to find you there as if I'm like being creepy. I'm not being creepy. I would love in healthier times. I can't wait to go back to Cambridge and pop in and say hello. It's just was so wonderful to find that you worked there and to have this conversation with you. So thanks so much for thinking of me because I know this was sort of your conversation to guide forth. And I'm just so happy to be here and chatting with you.
Thank you all to everyone who is listening. I had a great time talking with Kellen about sex and fiction and fan fiction and all things entertainment and gender and queerness.
Go queers!
And we close the chapter on another episode. If you liked it, and we hope you do, don't forget to subscribe and follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, we're on them all. If you really like what we do, you can support us by following on Instagram and Twitter at MisshelvedPod. Early access to episodes, as well as lots of other cool perks, are available over at my Patreon. That's patreon.com/NEBrinkley. We'll be back with another episode for you in 2 weeks. Until then, happy reading!